Good afternoon, all. So I want to begin with, just to let you know, next week's Parshat discussion will be recorded on Monday or Tuesday because we're going for a little mini vacation to New York. So I just want you to be aware of that. Again, it will be archived. You can always go to my YouTube channel or contact me for information about how to get there. You can see all of the Parshat discussions on there whenever you're ready. Parshat VaYikra, 5784, that's this year. The rules of loving relationships is what I am calling this at this point in time. I'm going to begin with a full disclosure. I shared the skeletal contour of these words of Torah 8 years ago when we had our partnership minyan meet in our home monthly for Kabbalat Shabbat. It was closed down by COVID, as many gatherings were, and just never reinvigorated. I have expanded this for this moment in time because I am feeling the weight of its message at this moment of inflection, where there are too many attacks on who we are, and too many of our own youth and community members opting out of too much of what we are. And therefore, we need to think further about who we are, what we do, what it all means, and why we do it. For this week's Torah readings, we have an interesting juxtaposition between the portion we read for Shabbat Zachor and our weekly Parsha of VaYikra. For the first segment of the middle book of the Torah, that we are to follow in offering our various Karbanot, those clearly dictated and detailed offerings we make to God. As so many of our commentators explain, we do not understand them, nor can we always discern the reason for them, and yet we were to follow these carefully laid out dictates in basically a no-nonsense manner during the times of the sacrifices. This follows and parallels the instructions for, and then the ultimate building of the Mishkan and the Mizbeach, where we may not necessarily, again, understand the symbolism of all the individual components, though there have been many efforts made to explain these through the years of our learning tradition. It is worthy to note that these specific instructions for the Karbanot follow immediately after the explanation of, the institution of, and the completion of the Mishkan, which has totally been the focus of the last 5 Parshiot of Shemot, discussed during that number of previous weeks. In other words, in terms of literary composition, now that the preparatory work has been completed, we now discuss the function of the carefully scripted and completed Mishkan. Further, this is amplified by our Haftarot, which have paralleled the instructions for the Mishkan and with those of the Beit HaMikdash. That being said, whatever reasons may or may not make sense to us, it is not that sensibility that is the determining factor of these details. Rather, it is God who has dictated all components, and we follow those dictates regardless of what we understand to be the underlying purposes. This is the nature of an entire category of mitzvot, or commanded actions, our chokim. God imprints chet, kuf, v'chakeh, them upon us as a sign and an action in which we participate. And of course, the need for this dynamic is amplified by the one building structure that was done without these instructive details, namely the Egel HaMasechah. Nonetheless, we want to understand what we do and why we do it as people of reason. And these very reasons for the Karbanot are, according to Nechama, the source of a huge debate between Rambam and Ramban. Rambam, in his Guide for the Perplexed, teaches that it is precisely this lack of understanding on our part that validates the very purpose of the Karbanot, to bring us closer to God, through our yielding to the purpose of God without necessarily knowing or comprehending it. We are actively involved and validate and confirm that God is our ultimate ruler by responding to God's dictates. I don't know how many of you were able to participate, but today at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, with the appropriate alteration or accommodations made for other time zones, all Jews were being asked to say the Shema in solidarity with the people of Israel, the concept of Israel, and remembering and keeping in mind all we are supposed to be. This is active involvement, that God is our ruler and that we are God's people and that we are connected to each other. As people, human created beings with the faculties bestowed upon us by God to seek reason and act intentionally, this may certainly be excessively challenging. I would submit that this is the very reason that too many of our Jewish brothers and sisters of faith do not hold on to prayers, practices, and ceremonies in which they struggle to find meaning, or they struggle to find the connection between what those particular elements are and the meaning in our larger lives. The real challenge here is to realize that our capacity to reason and understand should be used to dig deeper and try to ascertain what God is communicating and how we receive that message, not to just throw the proverbial baby away with the bathwater, as unfortunately is too often the case. This is seemingly counterintuitive to us as people of reason, to use Soloveitchik's proposition regarding halachic man. Yet it is very much a part of our gestalt as halachic man, combining reason and faith, each strengthening while also keeping the other in check. As Soloveitchik teaches in his treatise, Halachic Man, the will of homo religiosus, the religious being, gradually wanes to nothingness, and his selfhood is inexorably extinguished inasmuch as he desires to immerse himself in the totality of existence and to unite with infinity. Halachic man, however, protects his own selfhood, his particularity, his soul's private domain. The I, the self, is also part of that concrete reality which halacha purifies and hallows. In other words, what he's saying is we have the man of reason, the individual of reason, for whom religion may not mean anything. We have the homo religiosus, who could float away or disappear or melt away by being too spiritual and just not remaining grounded. For Soloveitchik, and for many of us who abide by this thinking or who find a simpatica there, being a halachic person both grounds us and gives us the spirituality. In other words, instead of letting go of practices that we may at first glance not feel connected to, we work, we try, we continue until we find that connection. In contrast to homo religiosus, that is, that spiritual being that's not connected to anything concrete, halachic man, continues Soloveitchik, forges for himself a concrete, this-world personality. And he goes on to explain how prayer, in replacing sacrifices at that time, how these concrete elements do this. We do not require miracles or wonders in order to understand Torah. The approach of the world to the world of the halachic person with his mind and his intellect balances the approach of the cognitive person with their response to the natural realm. Halachic man, for Soloveitchik, is a spontaneous, creative type. Halachic man and women, person, we're not using the term in a gendered way, just to be clear, is not particularly submissive and retiring, is not meek when there is a matter of maintaining one's own views. Rather, we are grounded and we hold on to those views. In my work these days in the multi-faith world, I acknowledge that there are great, great challenges. And as I keep saying, I can continue to go into these multi-faith spaces. I can continue to hear points of view different than mine, although I do have my lines in the sand. But I can do that precisely because I know who I am when I enter the room, I know who I am when I'm in the room, and I know who I am when I leave the room. Neither modesty nor humility characterizes the image of the halachic person. On the contrary, halachic person's most characteristic feature is strength of mind, according to Soloveitchik, which I just explained. We will do battle for every jot and tittle of the halacha, not only motivated by a deep piety, but also a passionate love of truth. So, this is where our practices come in. This is where Karbanot enter. And by association, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, our regimen of tefillot, to structure our element of being homo religiosus while avoiding our flying away into striving to be unio mystica. In other words, the unfathomable mystical person that can't live through the reality of this world. Our lives as human beings with a sense of reason are filled with details and instructions and adjustments for limitations and needed adaptations to keep us real, as we say. And we will be reading about so many of these prescriptions during the coming months from our book of rules, VaYikra. Rambam reminds us that God had to structure the Karbanot because it should be specific to God and God's dictates and not look like those offerings of other people, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, as we learned with the Egel HaMasecha. Idolatry had indeed already taken hold of all people, the Jews included. Remember, Rachel had her do da'im. This notion, what they knew to do with the Egel HaMasecha was because they had seen it. And the specific nature of the Karbanot was defined as a statement against that. The practice of the Karbanot was to have us focus on the oneness and the singular and collective nature of our relationship to God. Ramban, Nachmanides, reacts against Rambam, Maimonides, anthropological, psychological, sociological, historical explanation that has been identified by scholars. For him, for Ramban, it's an N, all Karbanot, as all mitzvot, have a transcendent value in the spiritual world and do lift us up to God, so to speak. Why else should we talk about the need to have a pleasing odor to God? Ramban is not worried about the dualism that Soloveitchik works so hard to avoid in the coming together of both the groundedness of human beings, B'nai Adam, or reason and our spiritual and soulful being as a homo religiosus. Rather, for Ramban, sacrifices as such were always part of the human story. We read of those offered by Cain and Abel, by Noach, way before idolatry and such social ills were identified as we came to know them later. We find a similar dynamic in this debate when considering the dress of the Kohanim and the Kohen HaGadol, whereas Rambam is looking at what is specific to the Bnei Yisrael, Ramban is looking at the transcendence into the spiritual world and the upper meanings, possibly contributing to that type of flying away that so concerns Soloveitchik. Interestingly enough, for Rambam, the human being that God created was perfection and was missing the point too often, while for Ramban, the human being was imperfect and had to strive to be raised to the transcendent. So, what exactly are the Karbanot? The testimony to this developing relationship between God and the Jewish nation, which will later evolve into our present regimen of tefillot, as Rambam sets forth, or are the Karbanot the eternal need of imperfect man, as Ramban would have it, trying to achieve something higher than himself? Why does it matter? Does it matter? Let us peek at the very beginning of Sefer VaYikra and observe for just a moment. Pay attention to the specificity of the detail contained here. VaYikra Moshe vayidaber Hashem elav me'al hamoed lemor. And God called to Moshe, and God spoke to Moshe from the tent of meeting, saying. In other words, what Rashi wants us to understand is that here the divine voice, why does it say El Moshe? It says, the divine voice called out and emanated from the Ed only to Moshe. But while Moshe heard it, the rest of the nation did not. This notion of receptivity to cues, again, is something that we see often. I talked about it in terms of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a very important film by Steven Spielberg at a time when he was addressing his own religious development in many ways. Notice that the chain of understanding is maintained here. God speaks to Moshe, and we talked about this a little bit about him and Aharon earlier. Moshe then absorbs the meaning, and then when Moshe is ready, he will convey it to the people in a way that hopefully they will understand. The text continues. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amata alehem adan ki yakriv mikem korban l'Hashem. Speak to the children of Israel and say, when a person from amongst you brings a sacrifice to God, it comes from the animals, from cattle, from flock, you bring the sacrifice. If it's a burnt offering, he shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. He shall lean his hand, in verse 4, Usmach yado al rosh ha'oleh, he should lean his hand on the olah, which indicates his ownership, his connection to the offering that's going to go to God. What we see here is that this is not a passive involvement, but a very active one. Each person is involved physically, intentionally, and purposefully. Usmach yado, he places his hand. This leaning is important in terms of connection to the object of the korban, the individual offering it, and God who receives it. We lean into our prayers, into our actions, into our intentions in our Jewish and human life. This is so important that in the Talmud Bavli, in Masachet Chagiga, it is indicated that accommodations are made so that all can be included in their involvement in this very visceral experience, especially women. Something for some of our rabbis and communities to remember at this time when sometimes women are needlessly excluded or sidelined. He shall slaughter the young bull before God, and Aaron's descendants, the Kohanim, will wring the blood. They will throw it upon the altar. He will skin the burnt offering, and the descendants of Aharon the Kohen will place the fire on the altar and arrange the wood. Aaron's descendants, the Kohanim, notice this is repeated many, many times. B'nei Aharon ha-Kohanim, B'nei Aharon ha-Kohen, it goes on and on. Will then arrange the pieces on top of the wood, which is on the fire, which is on the altar. While this may almost sound comical in the tone of Haggadah, the cat that eats the da-da-da-da-da, the point is that each instruction is given individually. The next instruction is given, this is repeated. The next instruction is given, this is repeated, v'chulei, 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 so that there is no misunderstanding. Similar detailed instructions are then given for all the different types of sacrifices as the text continues. We then move on to our maftir, which is known as Shabbat Zachor, the Amalek, you must remember. And we read as follows. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek b'derech b'tzeitecha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember what Amalek did to you on your going out of Egypt. Asher kacha b'derech v'yazanef lecha kol anechat shalim acharecha v'ata ayef v'yageh v'lo yireh Elokim. What happened was that the stragglers were cut off. What Amalek did that was wrong was they cut off the weak, the stragglers, when you were faint and weary and did not fear God. Therefore, it will be when God grants you respite from all of your enemies around you in the land of Israel, which God is giving to you, you shall obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from behind the heavens. You shall not forget. Zachor Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. Now, we read this particular maftir on the Shabbat before Purim. Why? 1, we are told that there is a genealogical line that connects Amalek to Haman. But let's think about this a bit more deeply. What precisely is it that we are supposed to remember? We read about what Amalek did to us by not being Yireh Hashem, by not being one who fears God, and taking advantage of the weak and tired, the most vulnerable, responding to his basic desires as one of B'nai Adam, just the physical person, not homo religiosus, not the one who is spiritually inclined, not the one whose humanity is raised by one's connection with God. By not being accountable to a higher entity, Amalek took what Amalek thought was his to take. Or so they thought. However, in the end, we are taught, and we hold on to the belief, that everything and everyone comes from God, and everything and everyone belongs to God. We read these very strong words at the end of this short portion. Zacher Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. Remember, lo tishkach, do not forget, and destroy timche et Amalek, and destroy Amalek from under the heavens. We then move on to our haftarah. Again, the one assigned to this particular parsha. Shmuel Aleph, Perek Tetvav 15. So we'll begin with the obvious connection. We begin the chapter with these words, Vayomer Shmuel Shaul, and Samuel says to Shaul, the Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over the people, over Israel. Now hearken to the words of God. Kol amar Hashem tzvaot hakati et asher asa Amalek liYisrael asher sam lo b'derech ba'olato miMitzrayim. God says, I remember what Amalek did to Israel, how he waited surreptitiously for him on the way when he came up out of Egypt. Now go and kill v'hikita et Amalek, and you shall utterly destroy all that is his, and you shall not have pity on him. You shall slay all, man, woman, infant, suckling, ox, sheep, camel, and ass. Clearly this sounds draconian to us today, especially given everything that we're observing. As Shaul was being anointed, we must take notice that this is the very first instruction he's given. It is, to be sure, rather extreme, but needed given the situation that confronted Shaul at this time for survival. Rashi explains that this is demanded of Shaul as he has acted foolishly in the past, and this cannot be continued. If he is to rule the Bnei Yisrael, he must act with wisdom and follow the mandates of God. Further, the ruler of each people, not excepting Israel, must first and foremost be concerned with his people. When a ruler is not concerned with the welfare and the goodwill of his own people, how can we even expect them to care about others? So what happens? Shaul and his people had pity on Agag and on the best of the sheep and the cattle and the fatlings and the fattened sheep and all that was good, and they didn't want to destroy them. So why do we have so much language about the fatlings and the best and all that? Is it the pity that they had on the animals, or is it that they wanted to take the booty? One has to ask those questions. The word of the Lord comes to Shmuel and saying, I regret that I made Shaul king. Nichamti ki himachti et Shaul melech. Again, that word nichamti, meaning both I'm comforted and I'm discomforted. Here, the PL. I'm not comforted. I regret having made Shaul king, for he turns his back from following me and has not fulfilled my words. Shmuel is very distressed. He cries out to God. And again, we are left with this disconnect between the instructions that were given, what was intended, and what happens. Shaul had pity on living things. How can we say this is a bad thing? Why should he be reprimanded for this? Could we not make the case that he is acting according to the fundamental Jewish values? A question that we often ask ourselves, especially in these days. After all, we have Avram so long ago pleading with Ribono Shel Olam not to destroy all of stone for the sake of the righteous. Is this not the Jewish way? Let's continue. What's really going on here? Is Shaul's initiative motivated by honorable intentions? That's our question. Shmuel says, Halo katana benecha. Even if you are small in your own eyes, are you not the head of all the tribes of Israel? This notion of halo im katonata, that do we read it as there are bigger forces that are threatening to me, or do we read it that humility makes the best leader? We see this many, many times in our texts as an ongoing dynamic. God sends you on a mission and says, go, lech. V'charamanta et hachataim et Amalek v'nilchamta bo aklu klotam otam. Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and you shall wage war until they're destroyed. Why didn't you hearken to God's voice? You flew upon the spoil. And here we have the problematic alternative idea here. V'ta'at al shlau. You do not go and take the booty when you're fighting for survival. You don't do that. Shaul says to Shlomo, yes, I did listen to God. I did go on the mission on which God sent me. And I brought Agag, the king of Amalek, alive and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took from the spoil and the sheep and the oxen and the best of the man to sacrifice to God in Gilgal. Shmuel says, and here's your problem. Vayomer Shmuel, verse 22. Hachafetz ladoshem ba'olot uzvachim, kishmoa b'kol Adonai, hine shomea mizbeach tov, mizevach tov, v'hakshiv mechelev elim. And God says, do you think God cares about the choicest of the burnt offerings, about the peace offerings? Is that as important to God, kishmoa b'kol Hashem, as listening to the voice of God? Better to obey than to bring this offering. Better to listen to God, l'hakshiv, than the best fat of the rams. In other words, one of the challenges that we have as a B'nai Yisrael, as a Jewish nation, is our marching orders do come from God. And they are clear and they apply to all of us. One of the biggest challenges I think we have many times when we are looking at what's going on in the name of B'nai Yisrael, and we see actions that are unseemly, or we see power that is misused or abused, for many of us, we find that offensive. For others amongst us, we justify it as needed. Whose decision is that to make? And I don't have a ordained conclusion. I'm just literally asking it as a question. So here we find the deeper lesson. And this lesson will be repeated by many of our Nevi'im, by many of our prophets, all through the books of the Nevi'im. Sacrifices never, Karbanot, coming closer to God, never replace the intentions or the devotion to God. I'm learning, as you know, the Mishnah Torah from Rambam, and right now I'm in Hilchot Paraduma, the laws regarding the Parameisacha, and also, Paraduma, the red heifer, and also in other discussions, the Karbanot and the various offerings that are made. And one of the themes that keeps coming up time and time again is Im lo mitkaven, if you are not doing it with the proper intention, then the sacrifice is pasul. The sacrifice doesn't count. You've got to come with the right intention, you've got to do the details properly, and you have to have the proper motivation for doing it. Tefillot, similarly, do not undo actions that are abhorrent or not within the parameters of what God has commanded. We may not, actually will not, always understand God's dictates, but we are to follow them to the best of our abilities. I find this lesson to be particularly salient at this time, when we are confronted with the foundational belief of protecting all human life, while simultaneously defending what needs to be defended in terms of Israel's existence and viability. There is inherent conflict here. Many will sift to one side or the other instead of engaging with the conflict. How do those of us who are holding on to the conflict, who are holding on to the multiple truths that are inherent here, with intentionality, how do we wade through all of this? We return to Amalek and Shaul's misstep and failure. What is it exactly that we were to blot out? Making it up as we go along. Because as Ramban teaches, perhaps this too is the nature of the human being. And as Rambam instructs, we must remember that this is part of our nature, and therefore be meticulously careful about what we do in the name of God in being Soloveitchik's halachic man. Thinking with our gift of reason and remaining humble and correct in our actions as people of faith. Responsible and responsive to the one and only one God, the God to whom at 11:30 a.m., coming up on 3 hours ago, so many Jews throughout the world in unison said, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This indeed is a huge challenge for all of us today, and the approaches we take are just as complicated and conflicted. But that is the nature of our loving relationship with God and with each other. Shabbat Shalom, wishing all a joyful and meaningful Purim,